Hey folks, in today's episode, I'm flying solo. I've had a couple of solo episodes throughout the stint of the show here, and today is another one. And today I'm going to spend some time talking about Claude Code. Specifically, what it is, what's the value that SysAdmins can get from it specifically, because typically when we hear about these AI tools, especially tools like Claude Code, it's always through the lens of developers, right? And so I think a lot of SysAdmins tend to switch off when they hear the word Claude Code because, well, they think it's just some developer thing, and that's actually not the case. Claude Code provides a lot of benefits and advantages to sysadmins, and in today's episode, I'm going to talk about all the different ways that it can help you in your environment, help you learn, help you with documentation, every sysadmin's favorite thing. So I've got that and lots more in today's episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Hey folks, it's a new week. That means it's time for another episode of SysAdmin Weekly. This is your podcast by sysadmins for sysadmins and dedicated to all the tireless tech folks out there working in the trenches day in and day out to keep the digital world spinning. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got another solo episode going on today. And so my usual co-hosts are off busy in the trenches doing their sysadmin work. And so I'm flying solo on today's episode. So, today I've got some fun stuff lined up. I've mentioned on the last several episodes that I've had a bit of a backlog of community comments to get to. So I want to make sure we cover that today. I'm going to go through some news react stuff, some nerd hour stuff like usual. And then the main thing I want to focus on today is a bit of an extension of some of the things I've been talking about over the last couple of nerd hour segments and the last couple of episodes about Claude Code. And specifically what I want to focus on today is Claude Code for the sysadmin. So I know some of you are going to be skeptical, right? And admittedly, I'm skeptical when it comes to most AI things, but I've actually had some really good experiences with Claude Code, and I hope to share some of that with you all today. Now, with that, got to do the usual show plugs, get that out of the way, right? But, if you're new to the show, welcome. I hope you enjoy your time here. Again, we've got a lot of great tech and sysadmin type talk lined up for every episode. If you want a list of all the various links associated with the show, you can always go out to www.sysadminweekly.com. And it's just a simple linker site. It will get you access to all the different links associated with the show. We're also available out on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and we have a companion newsletter at newsletter.sysadminweekly.com if you would like some additional written content that goes along with the show. Now, if you want to leave a comment, like I mentioned, I have a backlog of comments to get through. I love reading comments on the show just because it's fun and it's great to see such an active community because we're all in the sysadmin trenches together, right? So I love love responding to comments. But if you'd like to comment on an episode of the show, you can leave comments on the YouTube versions of the show as well as the Spotify versions of the show too. Or if you'd rather use email, you can get straight into our inboxes by sending an email to contact@sysadminweekly.com as well. So with that, I say we can get to our news react segment. This is one of the two recurring segments that we have at the beginning of every show. And normally it's a segment I, talk through with whoever co-host I'm working with for the particular day. But since I'm flying solo today, I have really, it comes down to 3 or 4 news items, but they're all interrelated. And folks that are regulars of the show know that, I work in the cybersecurity space. So my news react items always tend to be very cybersecurity focused. And, well, I'll say it has been a rough couple of weeks for Linux vulnerabilities. And so One of these 4 items has not hit the mainstream tech news yet, but it sounds like there is now a 4th Linux vulnerability that is going through a bug tracking system. So I'm sure that'll hit the news at some point here in the next couple of days, but the previous 3 vulnerabilities are now well documented inside of the cybersecurity news ecosystem. I'll start with the latest of those 3, codenamed Fragnesia. I think I'm saying that correctly. And this particular vulnerability is tracked as CVE 2026-46300 with a CVSS score of 7.8. And basically what this vulnerability does is it allows unprivileged local attackers to modify read-only file contents in the kernel page cache and achieve root privileges through a deterministic page cache corruption primitive. So that was a quote directly from Wiz. And I'm reading this from a Hacker News article. I'll link this in the show notes so you can take a look at it. But again, key point here, right, is unprivileged local attackers, right? So this is not a remote code execution. This is local attackers. So the attacker already has to have some sort of local access to the machine, which is not outside the realm of possibility in today's world, but it is an extra step that an attacker would have to take in order to exploit this particular vulnerability. So one of the other previous ones that was disclosed was called DirtyFrag. That was what the community is calling another one of these 3 Linux vulnerabilities I'm talking about. This one was mentioned on May 7th by a security researcher of, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Hyunwoo Kim, published a working proof of concept for a Linux kernel local privilege escalation chain that he calls DirtyFrag. So there's 2 CVEs involved in this particular attack. So you got CVE 2026-43284 and CVE 2026-43500. So these 2 CVEs combined, chained together, is what leads to this particular flaw. And again, local privilege escalation. So same thing as the previous one I talked about. The attacker has to have local access to the machine. So I'll put a link to this particular article out there as well, so you can take a look at it. And quickly covering the third and, well, the first publicly disclosed one of these recent rash of Linux kernel vulnerabilities. This one was called CopyFail, and this is probably the one most people have heard about. This one came out back on April 29th, and researchers publicly disclosed a highly reliable, again, keyword here, local privilege escalation. So what it looks like to me, and again, this is without me digging super deep into the CVEs, my guess is what happened here is one general vulnerability area was discovered, and then researchers kind of poked at it a couple of different ways and found a number of different vulnerabilities that were either involved in that same security hierarchy or, closely related. Again, I say that without having dug into these CVEs super deep, but this particular CVE for CopyFail is CVE 2026-31431. Again, I'll link this article so you can take a look at it. But yeah, let's see. It was discovered. This is an interesting piece about this article too. Discovered in about an hour through an AI-assisted process. So they don't say it, but I wonder if this is a Claude Mythos thing going on, right? So if you've not heard about Claude Mythos, maybe you've been living under a rock for a while, but that is Anthropic's cybersecurity-focused AI model, and it's kind of been making waves in the security community. And it might be one of those things where, because I'm so close to the cybersecurity space, I hear about it regularly, and maybe the general SysAdmin audience hasn't yet. So kind of curious about that personally, but anyway. So yeah, they used AI to help surface this, and they go into great detail about the particular vulnerability and how it works. Like I said, I'll put that in the show notes so you can take a look at it. So what this all means for you sysadmins, right, is yes, everything I just read said they're local vulnerabilities. That doesn't mean they're not important vulnerabilities, though, because, I've read so many case studies about situations where attackers were lying in wait in certain networks until the right moment. They found some local vulnerability and exploited it, right? And lo and behold, the organization had no idea that, attackers were even inside their network, right? So just because these are local vulnerabilities does not mean they're not important. So want to make sure if you've got Linux boxes inside your environments that they are on your radar for your next patch cycle. So I know that my beloved Debian Linux is impacted by these, and many of these patches have already rolled out through Debian's package manager. So again, just make sure these are on your radar for your next patch cycle. So with that, next on my list is our second of our 2 recurring segments, this one being our Nerd Hour segment of the show. And this is, there's a funny joke around why we call this Nerd Hour. And if you go all the way back to, the early episodes, maybe I'll explain it now because it's been probably 30 episodes, 40 episodes since we explained it. But to keep it short, if I go back to one of my previous jobs, me and a couple of coworkers, we would always sit around and we start talking tech, and we get really deep into the weeds and like, oh, hey, cool, that's a really cool feature. Or, hey, what if we use feature X like this, right? And before we know it, an hour has gone by, right? And so we had a project manager that would frequently come in to talk to somebody in the engineering room about a project, and we'd be talking and geeking out over tech, and he'd be like, oh God, it's Nerd Hour again, right? And so that is the reason why we call this segment of the show Nerd Hours, because we're nerding out over the nerdy, geeky things that we do either in our personal time or in our professional time, right? Depending on what's going on. And so, the things that I've been working on in my kind of personal nerd time, I suppose, a lot of it has to do with Claude Code, which I'm going to talk about in the main segment today. But a couple other things I've been working on in regards to my lab is I've started hosting a lot of stuff that I use for regular project work on a lot of my side projects. So there's a lot of components of my home lab infrastructure that have kind of turned into production infrastructure, I would say. And as such, I've had to start taking the time to make sure that I have proper backups in place, to make sure that should something happen to the hardware that all that stuff's running on, that I have a backup that I can recover from. And so I've actually been making plans and probably doing a lot of this footwork this weekend in that getting offsite backups configured. Right now, I'm kind of eyeballing a storage service from Hetzner. That's a European cloud provider, but they provide a storage service that works directly with Restic backup. And I'll have to figure out what episode I talked about it, but there was an episode where Eric and I talked briefly about Restic. It is a Linux open source based backup application that has strong encryption baked in. It's decentralized, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? The good thing being is there's no centralized backup console that if it gets popped, all of the backups are at risk. But at the same time, there's no centralized backup console. So management at scale becomes a little tricky, right? Not completely unwieldy, but it does create some extra steps. Anyway, back to this Hetzner cloud storage service. They can act directly as a Restic offsite backup location. And the economics of it look very attractive. So I'm going to be looking at that possibly as an offsite backup target this weekend. And I'm also looking at setting up proper monitoring inside of my environment as well right now too. Right now I'm relying heavily on syslogs and smart monitoring tools. And I'd like something a little bit more centralized that also easily supports SMS alerting, and I'm not relying on sometimes brittle local on-machine Linux email infrastructure for alerts. So working on setting that up this weekend. I'm thinking, and I'm not sure if I'm even saying this right, Bestzel is, I think, the name of the tool. I recently wrote about it in the recent newsletter that just went out today, as of this recording, actually. And it looks really solid. My initial testing has been very positive, and I'm also going to be looking at possibly Uptime Kuma for some of the more external monitoring type of things. And both of them seem to have nice, easy tie-ins to run on top of K3s, which is my lightweight Kubernetes node. And yeah, so that's all the nerd hour stuff that I've been working on lately. Again, well, I guess quite a bit of nerdiness there, right? I mean, how many crazy tech words did I just use? Kubernetes and Bestcell and Uptime Kuma, right? Anyway, you get the idea. So that's what I've been working on in my nerd hour time. And it occurs to me that one thing I have never really asked about is, what have you all been working on in your nerd hour time, right? So I'd love to hear about what you guys are working on. Feel free to leave a comment. Like I said, you can leave a comment on the YouTube version of the show, the Spotify version of the show, or drop us an email. Or you could also go out to the GitHub discussions board, and you can leave it there too, and which ties me into my next piece of information here. I've mentioned it for a couple of shows now, but I would love to do an episode about funny and fascinating friend and family IT support stories, right? We all go home for holidays or whatever, and we always get that weird ask from a friend or a family member that says, "Hey, you know computers, right? I'm having this weird issue." And I've come across a lot of these stories over the years, and some of them have proven quite comical. And I, just like I like talking about, comments that our community members leave on the show, I would love to share your friends and family IT support stories with attribution, of course, right? Because I think it'd just be a fun community thing to do all together. And it dawns on me, maybe I was originally thinking like a podcast episode, but I've been thinking about what does it look like if we did a live stream at some point too. That could be interesting, and we could all kind of geek out and have fun with that together. But I have a thread out on the GitHub discussions board specifically where you can track your friends and family IT support stories. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so you can click on that and easily get there. But yeah, feel free to let us know, there if you have a story that you would like to share. Anyway, well, I think that wraps it up for our regular recurring segments. And now we can get to our main topic for today. And again, today I am talking about the, simple in title, but maybe not simple in concept, but the simple title of Claude Code for the SysAdmin. That's the idea behind my solo episode today. And Eric and I, we've talked about, some of the benefits of AI use on this show in the past. I've had a few episodes where I've kind of given a little bit of insight into how I'm using Claude Code in some of my own personal workflows, mainly for how I'm using it for the show, how to surface the topics that we've already covered, and, helping to flesh out a basic outline that I can fill in some gaps on, and, get the outline at a place where it's 80% ready, right? So, I mean, there's some places where Claude Code really helps with that, but there's also some really nerd hour type stuff that Claude Code helps out a lot with as well too. And Eric and I also did an episode specifically on GitHub Copilot. So if you're interested in how the whole AI story works with Copilot and GitHub specifically, we have an episode in the library specifically on that as well. And then one of our less frequent co-hosts, Mike Nelson, I've had Mike Nelson on. He's a dual Microsoft MVP, a great guy, but I had Mike Nelson on once or twice where we talked about AI and AI agents. So we've actually done quite a bit of AI stuff on the show. I'll link all those episodes. That way you can take a look at those and maybe find some value in there as you start dabbling in AI, generative AI use for your own SysAdmin tasks. But the first thing that I want to address as part of today's main segment is, I guess, what I'll call the grumpy sysadmin problem when it comes to AI. And to be fully clear and transparent, I am not exempting myself from this. There's a lot of times where I see some new AI thing come out, and I have that grumpy sysadmin problem myself, right? At some point as a sysadmin, you get to a point where you're just generally grumpy about certain things. And I can tell you my AI grumpy moment was when I heard Microsoft was going to start including Copilot tied into both Notepad as well as File Explorer. And those are two tools where I feel strongly that AI does not belong in them, right? Notepad is just a very simple, oh, crap, I need to write something down really quick type of application, right? And File Explorer, I'm not sure AI is at a point yet where I trust it doing file operations. I mean, it wasn't that long in the tech news. I think Eric and I talked about it in the last episode, if I remember correctly. Wasn't that long ago that we heard a story about Claude, which I'm talking about today. The vendor wasn't directly Anthropic. I forget who the vendor was, but underneath the vendor's shell, right, their wrapper, it was Claude was the model underneath. Anyway, in this particular case, Claude had basically nuked the company's entire primary production database and happily nuked the backups as well, too, which, coming back to my points about Copilot inside of File Explorer, I'm not sure I trust generative AI with major file folder and data manipulation yet. Not without assurances that it's going to listen to me and follow all of the rules and guidelines that are given to it, right? And so that was kind of my grumpy sysadmin moment with AI. It's just like, okay, all right, enough with the AI everywhere thing. We don't need AI in Notepad. We don't need AI in File Explorer. And I think since then, Microsoft has since dialed that back a little bit. I'm going to have to go look at the news on that, but I seem to remember they have dialed that back and said that they are either going to remove Copilot from some of those spots, or they're just not moving forward with it, depending on whether it's been implemented yet or not. And so I fully acknowledge that when it comes to AI, a lot of sysadmins have this whole, well, I don't need AI, right? And really what I'm saying here is that it comes from, in my mind, a reasonable place, right? Because most AI demos, most of the productivity type conversations around generative AI in the IT space are really centered around developers. And a lot of the hype is just vendor noise, right? We know in this space as sysadmins that vendors have to hype up their products. They have to get people excited, right? So there's a lot of noise around this as well, too. And there's nothing more exhausting as a sysadmin than being told, here, you need to adopt another tool that solves a problem that you may or may not have, right? And so when I first started dabbling with generative AI from a sysadmin perspective, that's kind of the mindset I had as well, too. And I've kind of been proven wrong, right? And not that I had a hard stance to begin with, but I see it more positively now in a sysadmin point of view, specifically to Claude only, right? I don't feel the same way about GPT or Copilot. Claude is where I'm at from a sysadmin point of view when it comes to generative AI. And I think the other important thing here, as we talk about AI, Claude Code for the sysadmin, is that the argument needs to be, and I think most sysadmins would agree with me, is that AI, it's not magic, right? It's not this magic solve all the problems thing. But if you can be very narrow in scope, if there's a specific workflow challenge you have, or a specific process that you have to go through on the regular, that you can easily plug in an AI tool to measurably improve how that process works and plays out, I think it's worth setting aside the skepticism, there we go, for just a few minutes, right? And so I guess where I want to start after that is, let's talk about what Claude Code actually is, because if you've not really been looking hard in the AI space, you may not know, right? Because GPT has kind of taken all the headlines until recently. And so Claude Code is basically just a CLI tool that it runs in your terminal. It lets you work directly with an AI model. I guess the way I would put it is almost the way that you would work with a knowledgeable colleague that is sitting right next to you, right? Like I talked about Nerd Hour earlier, right? I always was involved with a couple of us engineers just sitting next to each other, talking about geeky, nerdy stuff, or brainstorming through a problem. I have those same vibes when I'm working with Claude Code on certain issues sometimes, right? You can give it context. It helps you think through a problem. It can draft up scripts. It can run commands for you. And here's the important part. Whenever I've started integrating AI tools into some of my own sysadmin workflows, control is always like the end-all, be-all big thing with me. I don't want the AI to be acting unilaterally and making its own decisions. And I will say Claude Code does a fantastic job of, hey, we've been talking through X. You've asked me to do Y. Here's what I want to do to solve Y. Do you agree? Do you want me to go ahead and do that, right? And so, for example, let's say I have let's use the example of I've got a PowerShell script that I'm working on updating and bringing up to date for changes in my environment or something. I'm updating a script, basically, right? I can have Claude Code take a look at that script. I can provide it context for why I'm updating the script, what the script does, what I would like it to do in the future. I can provide it all that context, and then Claude can go and look at that and say, okay, these are my proposed changes. And just like a pull request, in GitHub or GitLab or whatever code forge you're using, Claude Code does a really good job of showing you the diff right there in the console, right? Hey, I have this file. These are my suggested changes, right? And you can see the changes right there inside the console. And you have a couple of different options that you can do from there. You can say, yes, make your changes. No, don't make your changes. Or you have the option of amending, right? Amending the ask after it's given you the proposed changes. Like, oh yeah, I like the changes that you made on lines 10, 11, and 12, but 14 doesn't look right to me. Let's do this instead, right? And so Claude does a really good job of not taking action without telling you. And then the other interesting thing along these same lines, it's not just to do with updating and writing scripts and files, but this also applies when Claude Code needs to run a command for some reason. So I don't remember what I was doing exactly, but yeah. So I was actually having Claude Code take a look at the SysAdmin Weekly GitHub discussion boards, right? And it could have done just a simple web crawl, sure, but it can also actually use the GitHub command line API to look at those discussion boards as well too. And so if it has to run a command in the background, either in this case, like I said, an API call, or it wants to move files around on your behalf, or delete a file, or make a couple of folders, right? If it's not just creating something, but it's actually doing an operation on your system, it will give you a preview of the command it wants to run as well. Or if you wanted to go out to the internet and do research on a topic, it'll tell you, hey, I'm about to go and fetch page www.cnn.com or whatever, right? It'll actually tell you the URL that it's trying to fetch, and you can allow or deny that, right? And so from a control perspective, I found Claude Code is very useful in that it will only do what I allow it to do. Now, it does have options where you can say, okay, inside this project or inside this folder, just go ahead and you're allowed from here on out, right? You can do that type of thing. I haven't, because I'm a little leery of that with a good reason, right? But you do have that option if you want. Now, again, I've kind of just given you the highlights of what Claude Code does. I think everybody has a pretty good understanding of what some possible use cases would be there, right? A lot of it comes to script generation, code generation. The one that Eric and I really beat on in our GitHub Copilot episode was documentation. Documentation. Every sysadmin's favorite thing, right, is documentation. Documenting environments, change control process, all that type of stuff. Let me tell you, Claude Code is a godsend when it comes to documentation. So, for example, I was making some big sweeping changes in my lab. It was actually around the Restic stuff. So Restic, like I said, is decentralized. I've been doing all the configuration in raw Restic, which is a lot of config files, and I'm using FTP to actually facilitate the file transfer so that things are encrypted. So that includes a lot of PGP type stuff, right? So it gets complex very quickly. And what I actually did is I could feed Claude Code like a lot of my command history and say, okay, hey, document the process that I took to set up, Restic on this particular server. And it can document the whole process step by step. And then I took it a step further and said, okay, cool. Based on the documentation, how about you write me a bash script that will simplify as much of this as possible? And for any manual steps that need to be taken, factor that logic into the script to pause and prompt me as the user of that script to go and do whatever that manual step is, and then allow me to come back and say, yep, that step's done, continue. And so not only did it document that process nice and neatly for me so that, 3 months from now when I have to do it again and I've forgotten how I set it up, it's all right there and documented. And even better, there's a script that I can now use to do it as well too. And so Claude Code has really saved me a lot of pain and hardship in the documentation side of things. And so, I think the big aha moment for me on top of that, and this is where I really started to integrate Claude Code into a lot more of my workflows, was this idea of the Claude.md file. Now, if you're not familiar with the file extension .md, .md stands for Markdown, and regular listeners of the show, they will know that I stand on top of mountains and I sing the praise of Markdown whenever I get the chance, just because as a documentational language, Markdown is super powerful. I use it all the time. So I was super happy to see that Claude Anthropic likes to use Markdown for this particular file. Now, you may be asking, what is the Claude.md file? And I would say that this is the file that will make Claude Code very useful to sysadmins. And so, depending on how much you've dabbled with AI as a sysadmin, maybe you know this already, maybe you don't. From what I've seen, a lot of sysadmins that I've talked with, they've used enough AI to use it very much in a chat bot type of mode, right? What we've known as AI up until recent history, and that you open up a web interface and, hey, GPT or Claude or whatever, right? I'm working on problem X, this is the situation. You type out this big long prompt and you say, go, right? Well, you think about all the context that you have to provide in a very detailed prompt, right? Like this is how my environment's set up. This is, the language that I want to use for this script. Here are a couple of considerations that I've thought about for this particular script, right? You have to provide context. Well, in certain environments, certain projects, there's context that probably doesn't change, right? From prompt to prompt. And that's what Claude.md is really designed for. This is where it gets very useful for sysadmins. Claude.md is basically a plain text file that you drop inside of a folder structure right at the root of a project, and it tells Claude exactly what the environment it's working in is, what are the conventions for the project you're working on, what things should it never touch. There's a folder named confidential in this project. Don't ever touch that for whatever reason, right? Just as an example. Claude Code, when it loads up inside of the CLI, it reads Claude.md for every session. And what it allows you to do is to stop re-explaining the environment from scratch every time, right? So if, you've got a lab environment that mirrors production, right? In your Claude.md file, you can set context about your lab environment, say, hey, this is the lab environment that we're generating scripts for, and you don't have to tell Claude that information every time it loads. It already has that context. It already has that knowledge for when you start asking it to do things for you. And so that was one of the big aha moments for me, because now Claude.md has really become institutional knowledge, right, for the projects and things that I use Claude to help me with, right? And so it actually helps simplify the generative AI workflow, right? And I found that since I've started using Claude.md in my own personal projects, that my productivity with generative AI has exploded like a lot. And it's, in the early days of AI, I remember starting to use it for little things here and there, for script generation, for basic code generation. And I remember fighting with it a lot. Like, hey, I want you to do this thing. No, not like that. No, not like that. No, not like that. No, okay, you got it kind of right, but you need to change, right? Everybody has had that experience with GPT or Claude or whatever. But I found that once I started using, kind of these context files, Claude.md, that doesn't really happen anymore. If I take a lot of time to really nail down that Claude.md file, I noticed that this doesn't help hardly at all. And the other thing I found really useful, kind of the chicken and the egg thing here, right? Claude is actually really good at helping you generate the Claude.md file. You kind of explain the project, and I always prompt it. I'm like, hey, I need to create a Claude.md file for this project. What information do you need to know? I'm trying to do A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. What info do you need from me to effectively build a Claude.md file? And I found it generally gets you 80% there, and you have to tweak the remaining 20%. But, like I said, it has been a real game changer. And so to give you kind of a tangible example here, right? So for SysAdmin Weekly, I've mentioned this in the past, that when I start coming up with ideas or outlines for a new show, one of the things I want to do is make sure that I haven't covered a particular topic already, right? So, I mean, in this case, I knew I hadn't done a Claude Code episode yet, right? But, assuming I wasn't sure, I would have taken the time to go out to, Apple Podcasts or YouTube or whatever. And, well, we're about 50 episodes in now. I don't want to scroll through 50 episodes and make sure that I haven't covered this particular topic yet, right? And so one thing that I did is I used Claude to go out and crawl the show, document every single episode that we've done already with, the topics that are covered in all those episodes. And I had it build me an episode topic index file inside of my SysAdmin Weekly repository. I then updated Claude.md to tell Claude that, hey, the episode index for SysAdmin Weekly is contained in this file over here. So it knows that when I start saying, hey, let's brainstorm some ideas for the show, it knows what topics we have already covered. And the other thing that's nice about it is if I start doing, another Hyper-V episode, it knows that, episodes 8, 13, 26, 27 are Hyper-V episodes as well. Would you like to link them in your outline, that type of thing, right? And so it starts creating, like I said, that institutional knowledge that helps me be more effective when I start working on the next outline of the show or things like that, right? And so things that are covered in the Claude.md file for SysAdmin Weekly, right, are output formats, co-host names, styling rules for the outline. So I'm very particular about how my outlines for the show are typed up. And so it knows exactly how I like my outlines for the podcast set up. I have things like file naming conventions defined in Claude Code. I have a podcast outline or podcast outline templates file. There we go. That it looks at before it starts drafting an outline based on the key points that I want to cover. Things like that, right? Stuff that under the old method of doing generative AI, I would have had to tell it all that information for each prompt, for each time I need it to do something. And Claude.md has taken all that work away, which is fantastic. And so, again, that's kind of, like I said, a real example of how I'm using Claude Code for SysAdmin Weekly. Again, I've used it for a ton of scripting and things like that. People know that I've got a couple of little ncurses-based terminal utilities that I've built over the last couple of months that are they're built in Python. My Python is... it's okay at best. I'm not the best Python coder around, but I can at least get most of the way to where I want to go with it. And then Claude has been great in cleaning it up and fixing some of my poor code quality. Because, again, I'm not a developer by any stretch of the imagination, but I dabble. And, again, Claude has been great in documenting, hey, how does your music TUI Python tool work, right? Music TUI is just a simple shell wrapper I have that allows me to control Apple Music from within a terminal window. So kind of cool. It's useful for those Mac people out there. Yes, I could just use my keyboard shortcuts, but I'm working in a terminal all day, every day with my Markdown documents. It's kind of nice having a little terminal applet in the bottom left pane of my terminal window that tells me, oh yeah, this is the artist that's on currently. This sounds pretty cool. I've never heard this song before, right? Anyway, I'll put a link to that utility in the show notes if you guys are interested. So anyway, again, just some examples of how I've been using Claude Code myself. The other thing that Claude Code has been great for is dealing with YAML files with my K3S cluster. That's my Kubernetes Lite cluster that I use here in my lab that I run a bunch of microservices on. Things like DNS for the house. Heck, I have a persistent deployment in my K3S cluster for the Foundry VTT, which is a virtual tabletop system that I use for D&D and things like that. Yes, I'm a nerd, yes. But in dealing with YAML files inside of Kubernetes, Claude has been great in helping me document all that and really understand why Kubernetes formats its YAML files the way it does. Because that's the other great thing that I found with just AI in general, but Claude Code specifically in the terminal where I do most of my work, I can ask it questions too, like, okay, that's weird that the YAML file is formatted in this particular way. Why is this string here and not there? And what's the difference between these two strings? They look like exactly the same thing. It's great for learning as well too. And so when I think about more practical sysadmin use cases specifically for all of you, the audience and folks working in the trenches, right? I've kind of mentioned a lot of them, but I at least wrote down a few here that I wanted to talk through, right? So script generation with actual context, right? Not what we've done in the past, which is like, write me a PowerShell script to do X, right? Oh, but here is our AD structure, and this is what our naming convention is, and here's this thing over here that the script can't break, right? What's great about Claude Code is you could document your AD structure inside of Claude.md. You could define your naming convention. You could list all of the things that the script needs to leave alone. And Claude could build the script with all of those caveats in mind. And, right, let you review it before it writes it to a file. Incident triage as well, right? As like a thinking partner, right? Paste in an error message, put the relevant log files inside of whatever folder you're running Claude Code in, paste config snippets, and you can get back, structured hypotheses, findings. That's the one thing I've always said about AI. When people ask me, like, what's again, I work in the security space, right? So I get a lot of questions around the security discussions. But hey, Andy, what's a good way that AI can help in cybersecurity? And my answer is, and I stand by this, is I suck at log analysis. I don't know if it's that I don't like doing it. I find it tedious. The idea of going through a log file with thousands upon thousands of lines, and I'm looking for that one line that maybe indicates what the problem is, drives me crazy. I found that AI is fantastic at log analysis, does a great job of finding those outliers, right? But it needs context to do that, right? Context about your environment, about the how do I want to word it? About the situation around the error message that you're looking at, right? The various sets of variables that led to the whatever incident you're troubleshooting, right? Claude Code gives you all the tools to help deal with that, and it could be very good at log analysis for sysadmins as well too. And here's the important thing, right? It's not replacing your judgment as the sysadmin. It gives you that starting point so that you're not just staring at a blank screen at 2 a.m. wondering like, oh, I've got these error messages. I maybe have an idea what's going on, but where do I start, right? I found that AI in the troubleshooting process does a very good job of giving you a good starting place. Here are 5 things that it could be. And I've actually gotten to the point to where I start conversing with the AI and like, well, I don't think it's 1 or 2 because of A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, or I don't think it's 5 either because we don't use that particular feature inside of our environment, whatever, right? And it really, again, I always liken it to that trusted, IT colleague sitting right next to you brainstorming with you. And I found it works very well in that way. Documentation was the other practical use case that I wrote down here on my list. I feel like I've already beat that one with a dead horse, right? The one part here that I wrote down that I didn't really dig into as part of that documentation discussion is the runbook drafting, right? You can do things like describe a process out loud, right? And I'm like this with certain technical things. Like my Kubernetes cluster, I know how it's architected, right? I know how all the interconnected parts work. I know how services are served out to the network. And it would take me a while to really document that out in a very concise way that I could hand the documentation to somebody and they would understand what the hell it was I was saying. I found Claude Code does a really good job of just letting me word vomit into the terminal about just getting this technical information out of my brain and okay, now turn that into documentation. And it does a fantastic job of that, right? Very fantastic job of that. And like I said, the runbook drafting really helps you lay out that step-by-step process. Like I said, I took my my Linux terminal history when I went through the entire Restic client setup process, and I said, hey, create a step-by-step guide for me based on my terminal history, And so again, fantastic option there. A bunch of practical use cases for sysadmin when it comes to Claude Code. So I've been sitting here singing the praises of Claude Code this whole time, and I want to be very clear and balanced here. There are still some places where it falls short, in my opinion. There are still situations where you need to stay skeptical. Like I said, there are options where when you run Claude Code inside of a certain folder, you're given the option in its responses to, you know what, yeah, whatever you want to do inside of this repository is fine. Go ahead and do that. I'm not there with it yet. I am very skeptical of the do whatever you want option, right? I want to go step by step through everything that you want to do, Claude, and say yes or no to each file write, each folder move, each file deletion, whatever, right? So you definitely want to stay skeptical there. And especially if you are running it in an environment where there's production data available. The other thing that you have to be highly, highly aware of as a sysadmin, as the trusted stewards of company data, if there is a data location on your network within your infrastructure that contains sensitive company information, sensitive data, personal data of employees or customers or whatever, for God's sakes, keep Claude Code away from it, right? Now, I don't say that because I think Anthropic is scraping everyone's data. That said, I don't know that they're not. They say they're not doing that. All of the big AI players say that if you have the option in your settings set to not train models based on my usage, we have to take them at their word, to my knowledge. And granted, I haven't actually gone and looked to see if there's independent third-party audits of this, but to my knowledge, there's not been any evidence otherwise. But the fact stands that if it were me, I would not inject private, sensitive data into an AI system unless it was an AI system that had heavy and controlled governance capabilities baked in. And even those, I think it's still early days on those, right? The only vendor that I'm aware of that I've actually looked at the governance side of their AI solutions is Microsoft. Microsoft has some stuff inside of their cloud ecosystem that allows you to wrap some governance controls around the use of Copilot for 365, but that's probably a conversation for a different episode. Anyway, be skeptical. Be leery of doing anything with sensitive data around AI. Now, that said, I have also seen some cases where, from an infrastructure perspective, Claude can get things wrong sometimes, right? Especially around like niche products, older versions of operating systems or software, anything that's changed in the last couple of years, right? The last 12 months. And whenever it generates a script for you or something like that, always treat it as a first draft. Don't just blanket take a script from Claude and go run it in production. For God's sakes, please don't do that, right? You always want to review the script. Make sure you understand what it's doing and why. And here's the thing. I mentioned earlier how you can use AI to learn things. Hey, that's a great script you made, Claude. Tell me about it. Hey, what does line 16 do? Wait, line 32 looks a little strange. Why is it formatted this way, right? It will tell you about the script and why it was generated the way it was. Use the tool in that manner. You know, it really helps with that particular case, right? Always read what it produces before you run anything in production. And here's the other thing that I think a lot of people forget sometimes. Not in the sysadmin space. I'm speaking more about general population AI usage, but I think us sysadmins probably have a better baseline on this. But obviously, Claude Code is not a replacement for actually understanding the thing. It's a great tool. It can help you with a lot of things, but at the end of the day, you still have to have that deep understanding of whatever it is you're working on, right? If you don't understand what the script does, running it just because AI generated it really is the same risk as running a script you found on Reddit, right? The tool amplifies competence. It doesn't substitute it, right? So anyway, I guess that's about the end of my rant about Claude Code. I think I covered most of the stuff I wanted to cover in today's episode. a couple of common questions that I wrote down here. I wanted to make sure I covered. Do I need to know how to code to get value out of Claude Code? No, absolutely not. Like I just got done saying that, yeah, I can do some Python. I'm really good at PowerShell, right? But I consider PowerShell an infrastructural language, right? A Microsoft specific language. I'm not sure I call it a developer language, if that makes sense. So when I, think about this question, do you need to know how to code? I think of Python, and like I said, my Python is not great, but I still get value out of Claude Code, even though I'm not a developer, right? And you can use it for all those things that I just got done talking about. Next question I had written down here is, how do I keep sensitive environment details out of Claude.md if the file lives in a repo? So again, a lot of people are probably using software forges to store scripts and things of that nature. And I just got done talking about how Claude.md is a context file that Claude uses. And yeah, definitely, you want to be aware of putting sensitive data inside of anything that goes into a repo that multiple people can access. Now, Anthropic has like a scoping system for Claude where you can actually, kind of set permissions and things like that. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes so you can take a look at it. But to kind of put it simply and quickly, because we're running out of time here, there are things that you can have Claude Code reference that only live on your local machine, right? Things like API keys, secrets, sensitive environment details, things like that. You can configure it in a way to where it doesn't get stored in that Claude.md file, and therefore it's not pushed to a repo somewhere where Bob in the other side of the company can view it and see secrets and things like that, right? So there's ways around that. I'll put a link to that official documentation in the show notes. Let's see. Is this just another thing that's going to get deprecated or paywalled in 6 months? Well, I'm not a fortune teller, nor do I play one on TV. But I can't say definitively one way or the other. But I do know that if you look at the industry, if you look at the news, if you look at community reactions to Claude Code, it is providing immense value to individuals, to companies. I would argue, and this is just my opinion, I would argue that Anthropic is doing a far better job of actually providing business value than a lot of the other players are, right? And so do I think Claude Code is going to be around in 6 months? Absolutely. I think it'll be here in 12 months, in 2 years, in 5 years. I think it's going to be around for a while. It is not going anywhere, in my opinion. So anyway, with that ends my solo rant. It wasn't really a rant, but my... I guess my Claude Code evangelism. I've been up here speaking the good word of Claude Code in today's episodes. But anyway, that I think wraps it up for our main segment today. I know we're running in on an hour here, and you have a busy day to get back to as a sysadmin. So with that, again, just a quick reminder here, you can find all the links associated with the show out at www.sysadminweekly.com. And again, you can leave comments, and I just realized. So let me finish my thought first. You can leave comments for the show on the YouTube version of the YouTube versions of the show, the Spotify versions of the show, and you can also drop us an email at contact@sysadminweekly.com. I just realized here I'm talking about comments, and I had mentioned at the top of the show how, hey, we're going to get through a backlog of comments today, and I completely blew right by it. So I guess we're going to have to do that in the next episode. I got a lot of comments I want to get to, and I've just run out of time for today's episode. So anyway, I appreciate you all spending some time with us. Hopefully you found some value in today's episode. And with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there, and we will see you again for a future episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Have a good one.